Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Yarmouk Cultural Center, part of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. We continue the 29th cultural season, celebrating Kuwait as the capital of Arab culture. We are honored today to host Dr. Tamer el-Leithy, a distinguished scholar in medieval Middle Eastern history. Dr. el-Leithy is currently an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo, with previous academic appointments at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Princeton. His work explores social history, religious dynamics, and documentary practices in the medieval Islamic world. Today, Dr. el-Leithy will present a very interesting and eye-catching title as well, Scribbles and Hats, or the Afterlives of Medieval Arabic Documents. As I was posting about or announcing about this lecture today on social media, I got too many people asking me about the nature of the topic, which is quite fascinating and interesting. So he will be examining paper fragments discovered inside medieval hats. His analysis will uncover the cultural and legal implications for this fascinating material history. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamer el-Leithy.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, for the gracious invitation. I'm very happy to be here. This is the third time I'm here, and I'm very happy. The first, the alibi was, I work on texts, right? I don't have much to do with images or museums, but the first time I had just done an edition of an Ottoman costume book, so that was my alibi. The second time, I tried to present some of the work I'm doing, which is on Arabization, Coptic Christians changing language from Coptic to Arabic. That's my current project. And I tried to present that as a history of a series of objects. That was almost 5 years ago, just before COVID, so it actually feels much longer. Today is part of a new interest, but also similar to the last talk, which is about thinking about objects. Thinking about objects and what they can tell us separately from texts, and sometimes about thinking about documents as objects. In this case, I have a series of objects that are very stubborn, in the sense that they are not really interested in telling me very much. And I'm going to try and unpack their meaning to try and get at a new history of what people did with their hats, but also what people did with certain kinds of documents. Okay, if we wanted to time travel to Cairo in 1500, say, and we didn't want to stand out as cultural outsiders, if we wanted to pass culturally, I think one of the things we would do best to think about is hats. Probably one of the most significant differences between our world and their world is the value of hats. People did not go with their heads uncovered, like I am boldly doing now. In fact, to uncover one's own head was an expression of desperation. It could be used as a practice of punishment, exasperation, but nobody did it sort of ordinarily as part of an everyday life. If we wanted to look at Mamluk hats in 1500 in Egypt, strangely enough, one of the places we should be looking at is Venetian paintings. Venetian paintings around 1500 had the strange habit of painting very traditional biblical scenes, Saint Mark healing the cobbler, right? Or the trial of Saint Mark, or an old baptism, a biblical scene, right? And strangely enough, inserting very, very realistic pictures of dress from Mamluk Egypt. Art historians have spent a long time thinking about what that means, whether that was some kind of coded enmity or whether it expresses the very close contacts established by Venetian-Egyptian commerce. In any case, what is really striking and surprising is that all of these people are wearing varieties of headgear that you would not see in Venice, but that you would see in Cairo, and with amazing specificity, right? It's not just any old turban, right? These are very distinct, different types of turban. This is something that was reserved for the military elite only. This was a charbouche, right? This was not something that any odd person in Cairo even would wear. So it is striking. Here is another case, a baptism of the Selenites. Everything I'm showing is from the 1490s and early 1500s. Here is the baptism of two pre-Christian sovereigns. And again, people are dressed in very distinctively late Mamluk headgear. And of course, there's a very striking, sad, forlorn turban that's standing on the steps that is reflecting a sort of the old life that they're leaving behind here. This, perhaps, is even more pointed than all the other ones. Mansueti's The Arrest and Trial of Saint Mark. Just early 1st century, this is Mark the Evangelist, and part of the story involves his arrest and trial. And here we not only have those same distinctive Mamluk turbans, which arc back a little bit. They're not the old turbans that we'd expect or see in earlier periods. But we see a very, very distinctive headgear here, which was referred to as the water wheel, or the naura, which was actually only worn by the Sultan in Egypt, Sultan al-Ghawri. There was only one Sultan who wore this, and this was contemporary with this painting. It's very, very striking. We know that Mansueti was thinking about the Mamluks because we have another stretch attributed either to him or to somebody from his atelier that is distinctly titled Three Mamluk Dignitaries, right? So he knew what he was painting, not just that he was painting these strange and unusual looking headgear. He knew what they referred to. Perhaps the most striking of these paintings, in this case anonymous, is called The Reception of the Ambassadors in Damascus. It's from 1511, and again, we see the distinctive headgear of, in this case, not the Sultan, but the Na'ib al-Sultana, who, standing in for the Sultan, this was like the second in command. This was the Syrian viceroy. So he was given the privilege in diplomatic settings to wear what was otherwise reserved for the Sultan only, this naura style, the distinctly sovereign type of headgear, of turban winding. Here, obviously, these are the Venetians, right? But if you look at all the other 4 dozen other people there, the locals, who are receiving them, there's so many varieties of different headgear. There are just half a dozen just in this small part here, right? Civilians mostly, with one exception here, and more. These are religious scholars. Here are the very distinct hats of the military commanders, the Mamluk Umara. And then, of course, like I said, the Na'ib, the viceroy of Syria, who's a stand-in here for the... So one striking thing, if you look at that last painting, is how did they keep such hats really strikingly standing up so high? Not all of these were of any material that could support such height. I'm going to call them tall, because after staring at them for so long, I actually begin to think that they're agentive. They actually rearrange relations between people and things. So they're not just high, they're tall. So there is a very strange archive that I happened upon several years ago when I was in Venice for something else, for a workshop, and found out that there is this very extensive collection in the Venice, the Vienna library called the Rainier Collection, and I'm going to talk today about the stuffing that was found in these medieval hats. the collection is very striking in the Austrian library. It's called the Papyrus Collection, but it actually includes items on papyrus and on paper. It's 180,000 items, but again, over 3,000 years, spanning 3,000 years from ancient Egypt to the end of the Mamluk period. And they're in a variety of languages: Demotic, Greek, Coptic, and of interest to me, the Arabic ones. The ones on papyrus are actually the bigger part of the collection of the Arabic ones, but there is a sizable group that haven't actually been studied much on paper. Only in the past few years have scholars started looking at the paper Arabic documents. Still, they would dwarf any collection in any other library that I know of outside Egypt. It is a remarkable expression of a very singular moment of collecting in the late 19th century, when a few papyrologists seemed to have very good contacts in Egypt and kept writing them. They refer to them in typical colonial condescending fashion as my Arabs. They wrote letters to them asking them to simply buy whatever they can get their hands on. So we have items that were taken from archaeological digs. We have items that were on the market. And 1860s and 1870s, 1880s, Cairo had many things on the market, things that would not be on the market today. So, like I said, about 80,000 of the 180 are in Arabic. The majority on papyrus, but I work on later things. So, paper means that we are 10th and later centuries. Paper comes on the scene basically in the early 8th century. But by the 9th, it begins to displace other support mediums in most places, but in Egypt especially. In most places, it was parchment, but parchment is very expensive, right? To produce a single one of those big, impressive, large Quran codices, you would slaughter dozens of animals, right, to come up with enough parchment to produce a manuscript that large. So it was expensive, it was time-consuming, and it took particular kind of knowledge. Paper, by contrast, is very different. Paper is very cheap, it's modular. There are two kinds of producing paper. You can produce paper from bark trees, but the one that was used most commonly and almost everywhere is recycling of old fabrics. So the story here is actually an interesting way by which fabrics are connected to paper, and paper, ultimately recycled, gets put into fabrics in another way. But I'll get to that at the end. So starting from the 10th century, we begin to see in Egypt, which was one of the few places that had another writing medium, papyrus, paper displacing papyrus, because even vis-a-vis this special writing support papyrus, paper was much more convenient. It was modular produced, like I said, very cheap to produce, and anyone could make it. There are any number of varieties of paper and any number of variables that would change, of course, as you might guess, the thinness and thickness, coarseness, the feel of the paper, the whiteness, all of which would change. But anybody in their backyard with old clothes can make paper if they took, a lesson for an hour from someone else, which is why it spreads like wildfire. It's one of these amazing technologies that spread really fast. In any case, in the collection here, I'm taking you from very big numbers, 180,000, then 80,000, and then what things that are classified as inscribed on fabric and Arabic are 53. Some of them are just Arabic. So, some of them are just inscriptions on fabric, right? Like the Taraz documents, which were actually texts inscribed on linen production. There was a fantastic Taraz factory in Photomed, Egypt. So let's exclude those because they're just inscriptions on straight up fabric. Today, what I'm going to call my sad and fragmentary archive comes down to from 25 down to 15 items. Those are the items that have been paper items that have something that was classified as Arabic, so it ended up in my hands, And they were classified as inscribed on fabric, but they were actually not inscribed on fabric, as I found out. They were paper items that had been stuffed inside fabric. So they were paper items that had been put inside hats, and it turns out all of them were hats, right? In many cases, the hats themselves have not survived, but paper stuffing was taken out as soon as they arrived in Vienna. And again, what I call the fortunate accidents here are not just of classification, which allowed them to filter down to me, but also this particular moment when you could get an item like a hat that had a paper stuffing, sometimes sewn into it, and with perfect 19th century gusto, decide, I'm going to separate them, right? Something that modern museums do not do. We have many hats today. I'm going to show you a couple of them where we can see that there is actual paper inside, that it's paper that is recycled, but no museum will actually let you take them apart. So even though the number is modest, they are actually the product of a very unique moment when people had started collecting, right, but had not developed a kind of museum squeamishness that we have today about preserving the integrity of the object, right? So they took them apart and they revealed the contents. In this case, the paper documents. Now, again, another reason I'm going to call them sad is that they are fragmentary, and in many cases, you're looking at something like this, right? They are tattered, they're not complete. You have a glimpse of some of the text, right? This is because I was like kind of peeping in and taking out folds to take a moment where I can just snap a photograph. And yes, I can see what these are. After several months and asking people, I can figure out what it is, but it's not a whole text, right? But what I can figure out is that it's a certain script. In this case, they're Coptic alpha numerals. In the Middle Ages, in medieval Arabic documents, you almost never, I mean, you referred sometimes to numbers in text, but more often than not, if it was a fiscal document, something related to the treasury, if it was an IOU, a financial document, more often than not, you had a special script by which you wrote the numbers. And we have some examples that I'm going to show you. So one is that the font itself, the script, started telling me something about what these documents were. Even though, as you can see here, I can tell this is a list, a ledger, right? But I don't have context, and I don't have enough to reconstruct it, right? Historians, whenever they find pieces of texts, love to reconstruct them. And if it's a formulaic text, then they can reconstruct it with some certainty, even when they don't have the whole text, right? If you have a marriage contract, right? Even if you have only one side of it, even if you have, you know, just a quarter of it, you can sometimes confidently, if you know the period and you know how it was produced in what tradition, you can fill it in from other comparanda. Here, this is the kind of document that does not lend itself to that. I know this is a receipt from the format. I know this here as a list of amounts, right? I know it says here dinar, which was the abbreviation, was the first and last letter, right? And I know it says 22, right? But I can't go much further than that. I am sparing you all the sides that don't have anything legible written on them. Here we have other information that comes again from the formatting and from the script. Here it's a receipt and the telling amount, the telling words of the mablagh, the sum owed. Here, this is these tatters that, again, you wish you could see more. And again, even in this thing that had been taken apart outside the hat, they wouldn't let me take it apart even more than that. So I was stuck with these side views that only showed me a few words from a certain angle. Something does, however, begin to appear from all of these, right? This is not from any one of them. This is a document that I found in the Geniza. The Geniza was this attic of a synagogue in medieval Cairo, where Jews were in the habit of depositing any document that began with a basmala, with a bismillah, because like Muslims at the same time, they had a fear that anything with the name of God on it should not be defiled, right? So unless you are going to dispose of the document properly, which means bury it or put it away somewhere, then you're going to put it in this Geniza, which means there's a storeroom. Here, I found a document that has nothing to do actually with Jews at all, but it was in the Geniza, in the Ben Ezra synagogue. It was a scribe in the administration who was sitting down to learn some of the scripts that you just saw, and you will see in other examples. The Diwani numerals, right? 1, 2, 3. He just goes through them all, and as he's trying his hand and learning them. It's one of the, technically useless sheets, but actually fascinating and very telling, and was very useful as I was trying to decode these fragments that come up and that use Diwani script. Here, as in another example I showed you earlier, is Coptic alphanumerals. Sorry. Coptic alphanumerals was another convention in Arabic documents of using Coptic letters to designate numbers. So 1 to 10, and like all of the alphanumeral scripts, you use one alphabet, and you take it going down 1, 2, 3, 4 until you reach 10, and then 10, 20, until you reach 100, and then from 100 it's 200, and so on. Here it's Coptic script, which eventually becomes stylized into something that was called Zimami numerals. Again, and here, which is what I showed you earlier, the guy trying his hand, this is what later the Ottomans would call the Siyaqit script, or in Egypt specifically was called Qirma. Numerals, and this is the only one that seems very neat, and the one that used that particular script here. But there is something that begins to appear even from all of these otherwise very limited, fragmentary, almost pathetic little tatters. All of them are from documents. Right? None of them are from texts. Nobody seemed to be recycling a page from a treatise on fiqh, say, or a book of Kalila Udamna or an Alf Layla Layla manuscript and putting it inside a hat. For some reason, we're looking at documents. For some reason, we're looking at documents that seem to have from their script. I can't reconstruct them, but I know from their script that they have to do with numbers, and not only numbers, financial numbers, right? Nobody would be using these particular scripts if they were writing, numbers of something else. So we're looking at ledgers, we're looking at account books, we're looking at IOUs, we're looking at merchants' books, which were cut up and tattered. And then used for the insides of hats. Based on these clues, I started looking for other places. So those are the ones I'm going to show you from Vienna. There are other ones that basically do the same thing, and I've showed you the examples of the scripts, the different scripts. So I found one in Prague. Again, a document that seems either a receipt or something that lists financial amounts that was stuffed inside a conical-shaped long hat. A tartour, a charbouche, any one of the high, tall, standing hats that we have. There is the kind of ghost, the after life of a Photomed hat, which now lives in New York. The hat, very little of it survives. There's a few more pieces, but you get the idea. somebody recently, a colleague, wrote an article in which he reclassified it from a Seljuk hat to a Photomed hat, and I find his argument very convincing. So it lives now in the Met Museum in New York. What was interesting is not the tattered parts of the hat itself, but that the Met, this he figured out looked exactly like these other hats, one in the Cleveland Museum of Art and the other one in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which had the same fabric exactly and very similar designs, as you can see. If you look here, the same geometric designs that were used on the sides here, which was part of his argument for that he was making about reclassifying this, which means reclassifying its geography, that it was not Iran, that it was not 11th century, but his argument was that it was 12th century Egypt. In his case, he could find the paper just like mine, which was one of these rare things when somebody finds something that was a jigsaw puzzle that you stumbled across, and they independently find something very similar. In his case, there's a bit more of the text that's showing, but already he could see from the folds that this was part of a conical hat, right? And that these lines of folding were going up to the top of the hat, even though we don't have the top anymore, right? This is why it makes sense for him to propose these comparanda as the shape on top, even though we don't actually have that part anymore. So he has more of the text, so he could decipher a bit more. Again, not very far, right? But again, it's a list of financial listing amounts we have actually in some cases here, we're not quite sure. I'm pretty sure it's dirhams. I doubt this was dinars, because we're talking about people, given workers given amounts. So here we see the amounts written in the same Zimami script that I showed you earlier, except here we have a few more words next to them, so it makes sense to classify this part as a list of payments to individuals, right? Another piece that could make sense, which seems to be all text, right, turns out to actually be a fiscal receipt. This was the receipt for the tax farm on an orchard for the year, for 2 years that begin in 244 Kharajiyya, so almost the same Hijri. And we are in Egypt distinctly because this was the convention. You put the year in the Kharaji year, but then you use the month, the Coptic months. So Bashans here, and then Tuba are good, Coptic months. So we know distinctly, and that's part of his argument, that this is coming from Egypt. Nobody in Iran would have dated a piece of paper like that. That was not the convention. So somebody had paid the receipt. And after this stopped being useful for them, right? How long do you keep a receipt for? You keep a receipt for as long as you might return to it, right? For as long as it would have some archival value. That's what archives are, documents kept for future retrieval. After that point, something like this, a receipt, like the ones that I saw, the tatters versions of, have become in an afterlife. They no longer have an existence that could be actively sought for the text that's written on them. So what do you do with them? Well, in many cases, you stuff them inside your hats, or any such other use you might have. I take you to this one guy that we saw in the reception, and here's another one that I found, again, separately at the Victoria and Albert Museum, just in a catalog entry, and I'm pretty sure that that's the one that was represented in the Venetian document. Again, if you just turn it, you can see that we are looking at a ledger list of some kind with a list of receipts. Now, the final one that I'm going to show you is something that is here at the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah in the collection, the al-Sabah collection. And in the current catalog, it's classified as a letter on cotton. And I have not actually had enough time to look at this, to look at the text on it, right? But as we saw in one example, even the texts themselves can be traces of a receipt, a fiscal or a financial document. Here, it's a letter on cotton. I need to look at this further, but from the shape, my suspicion is that this was also a piece that was inserted into a hat, because that's precisely the shape that we see in other ones. There's one in the Dar al-Kutub in Cairo that looks very, very similar, but the text is different because it's from an earlier period. So the script is different. But it's basically from the script and the formatting and then the shape of the cut pieces that I've been searching now and trying to find pieces like this. And like I showed you, found one at the Victoria and Albert in London, one in Prague. This is possibly in Kuwait. I have to spend some time with the text because I'm sure we can decipher some more of that. And there's one in Berlin, but I haven't seen it. I have to go see the actual hat itself it's in, but I don't really feel like going to Germany these days. So yeah, so at this point, these are the cases that I have a corpus of, like I said, a corpus of sad, maybe, but very telling, I think, fragments. So why is this worth caring about? I mean, I'm very nerdy, so I think it's kind of cool. But why should we care about this? I am arguing, if I'm right, then this is a patterned form of recycling. They did not recycle any odd piece of paper. Historians, when they think of something like recycling, are very fond of, they have a habit of saying, well, they just recycled whatever was around, right? Or they just reused whatever was handy. It seems like something else is going on here, right? I have one exception that looks like a letter, which I don't have a picture of here, but everything else, either from its formatting or from the script, is very tellingly a document, and a document that has to do with a finance or a fiscal related document. So I don't think it's, as the historians usually say, I don't think it's anything around. I think it's a patterned kind of recycling. People seem to use documents, and specifically documents related to fiscal amounts, financial amounts. Why? Okay, so that's, I'll come to the question of why. Second, I think the case is interesting because it's one of the rare kinds of moments that historians are able to beat preservation bias. Medieval people and, people after them keep documents when they really care about them. In this case, I seem to have chanced upon 24 because they didn't care about them. And they still ended up landing here, and they still ended up being able to assemble together as a group. And my argument is that they form a corpus, right? So this is one of those rare instances when, because of this classification scheme of the Vienna library, because of when they were bought and the fact that they had no problem just tearing apart medieval hats, and because of the particular case, which is specific kinds of documents, patterned recycling, we can see something that beats the preservation bias. We can see what medieval people didn't care enough about to keep in their books and preserve and hand from one generation over to the other, right? Think of the opposite, right? Think of books of jurisprudence or books of literature. These are things people cared about to preserve, so we have lots of them. Here is something, and something that they did not care enough to preserve, at least in its original form. So it's a rare and kind of unique window onto a practice that we'd otherwise not know much about. Third, I think it's interesting because it makes us begin to think of the ways that objects can tell us, even documents, in this case recycled, tattered, but ways of reading documents as objects. The ways that they can tell us more than the actual text content that they hold. Historians are beginning to do that, and people have turned to it as the material, have referred to it as the material turn. I have colleagues and friends who've done fantastic work. There's a theorist called Bill Blair who makes a distinction between objects and things. And he says objects are those items that we look through to a world behind them because there is an idea we have about their function in the world. A thing, however, is when an object stops working for you. It's when your car stops working, right? It's when your glasses get dirty, right? It's when something becomes stubbornly recalcitrant in its function. It's not actually giving you the kind of work, it's not giving you the work that you expect from it. I think these tattered receipts are a perfect example of what Bill Blair would call things rather than objects. They were stubbornly quiet, but I think reading them in a different way can tell us something, and I think can tell us something that is unique because it's the kind of thing that texts do not tell us. It's the kind of thing that people writing your texts in the Middle Ages would either take for granted or not think was worth telling someone in a text, an ego document, right? Enter my final piece of evidence, which is a passage by a man who's I can only call dyspeptic. The man was kind of hysterical. He was a North African man in the early 14th century. He came from North Africa and today would be Morocco, and came and lived in Cairo and wrote a wonderful book that historians like very much, but it is basically full of him decrying everything that upset him. So the book is just this series of him going on about all the things that he sees as going wrong. Women going out on the street, funerary customs, people celebrating Coptic festivals, mixing across religious boundaries. Actually, any boundary that you can think of. Ibn al-Hajj was very much irate because somebody was crossing it without proper policing. Anyway, he has advice to even the most mundane occupations, including one amazing passage where he talks to bookbinders. And he tells bookbinders, you should use not any odd piece of paper, right? Because bookbinders, what they do is they use old pieces of paper and they put them to harden the edges of a manuscript, right? The covers. So don't use any odd piece of paper, right? That's wrong, that's haram, right? What you need to use, and the only thing that you should use, are dafatir and awraq hisab that have expired. Beware very much of using documents that refer to living people, and specifically ones that have living rights, حقوق, right? He was basically describing for bookbinders, but precisely what many people did, I think, in their backyard when they were stuffing their hats. They were recycling documents that at one point were very important because they related to paying a tax, right? You don't want to pay a tax twice. Or an IOU. You want to keep the IOU until someone pays you. But at that point, it stops being a document. It becomes a piece of paper. It reverts back to its state as pure matter, right? If scribes and notaries have this magical touch whereby they turn a piece of paper, a piece of matter, into an active document that can do things in the world, then at that moment when documents expire, it's the other way around. They die. And it's precisely at that moment of death that they become the subject of my sad and fragmentary archive. Thank you.